Well, good morning, everybody. If you're on the West Coast, good afternoon. If you're on the East Coast of North America, good evening if you're tuning in from the UK, Europe, or the Middle East. And a good, very good evening or late evening to our folks from friends from India and the Philippines who tune in. Jack, we've got hundreds of people signed up to see this show. So first of all, thanks very much for taking the time to join us here. Everybody, the title here is influence versus control. The power of storytelling with Jack Jackson, and the, there's a story right from the very beginning that Jack actually told to so many thousand people, really about influence versus control. And then remember, Jack, I got a hold of that Terry Tate video, and I said, "Oh,
Yeah.
you got to find a way to work this into an office linebacker." But anyhow, Jack, thanks so much for taking the time to join us. Everybody, thanks so much for tuning in. This is going to be a very informative show. Jack is a master storyteller. But before I go any further, I'd like to say that, in my opinion, having worked with Jack for as many years as I have, it's not actually his best strength. Um, Jack is an incredible coach. He does a lot of coaching work for Safe Start with all of the consultants out there. He's even helped with a lot of the consultants internationally. Former NFL player. I found out what that stands for. Not for long. Got an incredible sense of humor, but he coached football for a while as well. And Mike Shaw, who is the IT sort of technical coordinator for this show, um, Mike's actually been on the show, I think, a while back to sort of talk about resilience and grief. And if you, Mike's a former national level coach, and so I've had the pleasure of working with and also with Jack, some incredible coaches. But back to this storytelling, Jack. Why don't you just sort of start at the beginning for us and tell us um, how you sort of got acquainted with storytelling, or where it all came from, and when did you start to understand the power of
Well, it's
storytelling?
funny you said it. First of all, Larry, thank you for having me. First of all, it started out years ago when I was a kid. Whenever I asked my father, my grandfather a question, they never answered my questions directly. They always had to tell me a story, and that's how they got to this question, got to the answer for my question. They wouldn't actually give me the answer. They would tell me the story, and then they'd ask me, what do I think?" Then I'd walk away wondering why did I even bother to ask them the question if they were going to make me figure out the answer for myself. But as I got, but as I got older, I realized that those stories that they told me helped me to retain the lesson that they were trying to teach me, and it forced me to try to come up with my own answer rather than taking the easy way out and waiting for them to tell me the answer to the question. So I realized then that those questions and those stories that they told me had a huge influence on my decisions or the questions that I had from my father.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, we'll get later on in the show, Jack. We'll talk about some of the reasons why we remember stories so well, um, as human beings and stuff. But um, the very beginning, everybody, I how I met Jack. We do public trainer certification workshops literally all over the world, a lot of them virtually during the COVID pandemic, and still on. It's not like it's over. I'm going to Nigeria next week. Got to get a lot of tests. But anyhow, nevertheless, we've been doing these workshops all over. And I don't know whether it was, Columbus or Chicago or just where Atlanta, perhaps. But there are about 3 different breakout rooms, 4 different breakout rooms, and I try to go back and forth between the breakout rooms to see, just how it's all going after day one. And I walked into the room, and Jack was up at the front of the room telling a story. That's sort of part of every trainee's job, is they've got to get up, present part of the unit in front of about 12 people, a smaller group. But and they've also got to tell a safe start story. And I mean, he used the flip chart. All the technical stuff was all there, but I mean, the story. I mean, I'm getting the hairs on the back of my neck right now, Jack, are standing up. I mean, it's not just that we remember stories, it's that it can bring back the emotion. I mean, I remember like looking at you and the look in your eye when you were telling it. I mean, it's the dock plate story. And it was phenomenal. But after, I remember I made a beeline to see if I think we tried to hire you right then and there. I don't know. It's been working for us ever since. But Jack, you before that though, there was a story where you were working. Gosh, I can't remember the name of the place right now. But it had to do with the fingers, Jack.
Oh
and
yeah.
the influence versus control. So just sort of, if you could, to kind of back it up right to the title, could you tell us that one to begin with?
Well, the one, if we're talking about the same story, because there's several finger stories, and I tell people in
Well, the
my
one about you being hired as kind of the,
oh yeah,
the,
I'm the terrible Terry Tate guy, and I
yeah,
was a guy that always felt like as long as people knew the rules, they wouldn't get hurt, and there's no reason you should get hurt as long as you know the rules. Well, we had a hand power tool that ran at 30,000 RPM, surgical steel razor sharp blade on it, and everybody that cut their fingers, they knew the rule because whenever someone got hurt, we'd sit in a room, we'd do an accident investigation. When we did that accident investigation, we'd either modify the rule or we create a brand new rule. And the people knew the rule. Never try to free up a jam with the hose connected, your finger on the trigger, and the guard open. And yet, every one of those people cut their own fingers off. And I ask the question when I tell that story, do you think they did it on purpose? Well, the answer is obviously no, they didn't do it on purpose, but people don't get hurt because they don't know the rules. We talk about the knife, scissor, and a razor. We know that a knife, scissor, and razor is designed to be sharp, but yet we all cut ourselves. And oftentimes we cut ourselves not the first time, not the second time, but after we've been doing it over and over and over again, we end up cutting ourselves as a result of us not paying attention to the hazard. We become complacent with the hazard over time. So I try to influence people into thinking about what is it that you do on a routine basis and why did you get hurt when you did that particular task.
well, I remember you saying it's something like seven. I can't remember
Seven
the
fingers.
time, 7 fingers
Yeah.
you
In
picked up
7 years.
in
And I was
7 years.
not there to see one of them get cut off, Larry. And so
Right.
that's that the influence that you try to do as a supervisor slash manager, whatever is getting the people to do the right thing when nobody's watching. Now, the reason that I was not there to see anybody's finger get cut off because they were doing it the way they were supposed to do while I was there. When I
Right.
wasn't there, they didn't do what they were supposed. They didn't do it the way they were supposed to do when a jam happened. So I didn't wasn't there to see any of the fingers be cut off. But my approach at the time with that terrible Terry Tate, this aggressive approach and tackling people. I didn't literally tackle
I
anybody,
know. I know.
but I would let them have it pretty good if I caught you violating the rule. And that's not the way to engage people and influence people. The way you influence people is use some of those stories or those past incidents that you've had to hopefully prevent the next man from being injured. And I tell people this all the time. Matter of fact, I was speaking on yesterday in Chicago at the Safety Congress, and I did the art of storytelling. And I tell them everybody has a story to tell. Utilize those stories and talk to people about the stories, the things that you've done. I can learn from your experience without having to walk in your footsteps. So
Well, you
that's the
can. Well, let me. Yeah, for sure, Jack. I mean, I remember though you said, and for all, and I was getting pretty good at intimidating these people too, but
Oh yeah.
for all the good that did. And then I remember you just sort of hit us with the well, it's the punchline, except for it's not a joke. But in 7 years, I picked up 7 fingers off the floor. So the rules alone don't prevent
No.
it, don't prevent injuries, right? And
No.
so that part like stuck with me. It's funny, I can probably almost remember some of the words to some of your stories, maybe better than you can. Now, after, well, it's just because they do make a real impact on you. Now, um, in terms of the different kinds of stories
Mhm.
that people need to tell, um, and also, well, maybe you could even just start off with, why are stories so memorable and impactful? In other words, why is it that we remember stories so well? And if you can, give us a couple of hints in terms of what makes what makes a really memorable story. Like why, for instance, Jack, do all of us in the workshop team, we could all tell the Walmart story.
Well, it's funny you just said that because oftentimes humor is the thing that helps people when a person feels something, they get an emotion, and laughter is generally comes from an emotion. You were happy, or you thought something was humorous to you. They have those type of stories. People have a tendency to remember it. And it's funny you talk about the Walmart story because I don't ever recall ever telling that story and not having somebody laugh when I told the story. But it's not in the actual event as much as it is in the way you tell the story. Because when the event actually happened, to me, none of it was funny. But when it actually happened, none of it was funny to me. But if you're able to find the humor in it, when there's a humorous situation, so you actually have to set the tone. You know how we talk about the tone of how you approach someone. Well, the tone that you set the story in, it was a jovial story the way I made out. It could have been a serious injury though. I could have really been injured, and I'm sure you're probably going to want to hear that Walmart story again, or you could
Well, I
probably
mean,
tell
I
it.
actually, I don't, I'm like a little kid, I think sometimes, in that, if it's a good story and it's a good storyteller, I do actually like to hear it again, just because I also like to, kind of gauge or think about the reaction of the crowd. But the other thing that you said though about this is that it's a really, really good story in terms of demonstrating values in action.
Hmm.
Like we've all, I think, well, at least those tuning in from North America have probably heard the story about Abraham Lincoln, who realized when he was working as a clerk at the store that he overcharged this lady a penny. And
Hmm.
back then, a penny was worth a heck of a lot more than it is now, for sure. But he walked 3 miles to return the penny to her. I
Yeah.
mean, I know inflation. I know inflation's bad,
Yeah.
especially now. But um, I don't know if I'd walk 3 miles to return a penny.
No.
But that's a values in action story. You got to be kidding me. Um, anyhow,
But one of the things I would say, Larry, when you talk about that, the value in the action in what takes place is there are basically three type of stories. Now there's a lot of types of story, but when we talk about telling stories for the impact, you want to tell a participatory story. This is where the audience get to participate. And what I do with that one is I'll start by asking a question. And you've heard me say this before. It's a quote from Maya Angelou that people may forget what you said, they may forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel. So if I can make you feel something in my story, when I tell you that story, you won't forget it. And that's why the Doc Play story is so impactful. That's why the Walmart story is so impactful because people will actually see me at a conference and say, "Hey, you're the Walmart guy," and I don't work at Walmart. I'm not the Walmart guy, but they remember me because they remember the experience of hearing that story, or they'll remember the Doc Play story. because I made them feel something. And you start off with the participatory story. This is where you get the participant involved in your story by starting to ask them a question, and you involve their senses in that. You might say, "Hey, you ever been to a paper mill?" And somebody will raise their hand. Do you remember the smell of a paper mill? And they will remember that. Or you might say, "Hey, have you guys ever been to the state of Illinois? Remember driving in the state of Illinois?" One thing about driving in the state of Illinois, if you've ever driven in the state of Illinois, you won't forget the fact that they put the corn right up next to the road. I mean, it's corn stalks everywhere. Outside of Chicago, that's all you see is corn stalks right up next to the road. But so you try to create that vicarious experience through feeling. The next type of story that you want to tell is a process story. Now, Safe Start is very good at the process story. We teach people the process by sharing our stories. After I tell you what the process is, then I tell you the story. You can see the process in action in my story. And that's what, but it's also a combination of the third type of story, which is a narrative. And the narrative kind of plays out like a movie, kind of like the Walmart story does. It plays out like a movie. And so a good Safe Start story is a combination between a narrative story and a process story. Because now I'm telling you a story, and then you can see the process. You see the state to error risk pattern within my story. So I think that's very good when it comes to telling stories.
Well, like I said, the values in action stories, the teaching stories. Anyhow, enough of the instructional educational stuff, Jack. I mean, so why don't you why don't you tell us why don't you tell us the Walmart's like? But well, seriously though, I mean, this is not that we plan or choreograph these things, everybody, but Jack and I know each other pretty well. So I said, look, let's sort of talk about the overall, you know, 40,000 foot view from about stories, the different kinds of stories. And then you can kind of get to see this, if you will, the teaching aspect of it as you
Mhm.
listen to this story. So, on that note,
You want to start with the Walmart story, okay? So
I think I think it starts off with, I grew up in Missouri, so I'm pretty comfortable with the snow. But anyhow,
So I'll tell it from beginning to end, Larry. And
okay.
up to this point, people already know that I lived in Missouri, played college football in Missouri, and I raised my family in Missouri. But on this particular story, I pulled into a Walmart parking lot up in Baltimore, Maryland, and there's 2 inches of snow on the ground. Now I lived in Missouri for 22 years, so I saw snow every single year. 2 inches of snow was no big deal to me. I opened up the car door and I stepped 1 foot out on the ground. And as I raised up to get the rest of me out of the car, something is happening extremely fast, and there's absolutely nothing I can do to stop it. I am falling out of the car. I mean, whole body, complete body, falls completely out of the car. Now, I don't pop up immediately. No, I just lay there for a minute. And as I'm laying there, I start to think to myself, man, I wonder if anybody saw me. But how often do you go to a Walmart parking lot and there's nobody in the parking lot? It's like never, right?
Right.
So I did try to play it off, Larry. I went ahead and closed the door while I was laying there. And then when I rolled over and I acted like I was tying up my shoe. And then when I raised up and looked around the parking lot, everybody in the parking lot was looking at me. I'm like, oh man. Now, what I should have done is I should have gotten back in the car and drove off. Because one of the things I learned about the state terror risk pattern, if you fail to recognize it or acknowledge it, it will start to domino on you. But I decided to go ahead and walk inside the store. It's after Thanksgiving, but it's before Christmas. And you know how many people are in Walmart after Thanksgiving before Christmas, right? And they may be, when you walk inside a store, you can hear the buzz. You may not know what they're saying, but I can hear the buzz. They may be talking about how much they're going to spend it on this or that. That may be what they were actually saying. But in my mind, what I'm hearing is, hey, ain't that the guy right there that fell in the parking lot? Because I'm paranoid about falling in the parking lot. Then I said, okay, man, I'm walking down this aisle and this lady is calling my name. And she said, sir, excuse me, sir. And I'm like, oh God, I hope she's not talking to me. She said, sir. And I turn around. She said, do you know you have stuff all over the back of your jacket? Well, where I had fallen in the parking lot, all the salt, sand, and gravel that I missed with my foot is on the back of my black leather jacket. And I pull it off and I get to looking at it and I'm thinking to myself, maybe they were talking about me because it looks pretty bad. It looks pretty bad. So I started to dust it off, Larry. And as I'm dusting it off, I dust the loose debris off. Then I start to notice these white ashy patches on the back of this jacket. And everybody that lives up north or lives in winter condition, you know what this is. This is the salt water that's dried up on this jacket. So I know I have to get this cleaned up. So I make a mad dash up toward the front of the store, toward the restrooms. Right outside the restroom door, there's this little boy looking up at me. And he looked up at me as if to say, ain't you the man that fell in the parking lot? now, now, that's not what he said to me, but that was the look he gave. He looked up at me. And I walked on into the restroom. Now, when you get in the restroom these days, you know, they have motion sensors in front of everything. So I'm waving in front of the paper towels, and I get 3 or 4 paper towels. Then I hold them up underneath the soap and get some soap on my paper towels. Then I hold them up underneath the water. Then I hold up my jacket, and I'm starting to rub on my jacket. Well, as I start to rub on my jacket, I hear a woman's voice. There's a lady over in the stall talking on the cell phone. So I turn and try to tiptoe out the bathroom. But before I can get out of there, she flushes the toilet and she opens the door. All I can do is freeze. And she's looking at me, but she's still on the phone. She says, "Oh my God, honey, I gotta let you go. I think I went into the wrong bathroom." I said, "Oh, okay, it was you." So I turn back around, go back to the sink, grab the paper towel, start rubbing on my jacket again. The next thing I know, this lady comes over next to me and she starts talking to me. And she's talking to me like we're out in the produce section somewhere, Larry. And I'm saying to myself, man, how bad can this be? I'm looking at the lady and I'm looking back at the door. And I look back down at the lady and I look back at the door. And I can't help but think that if somebody comes in here right now,
this isn't going to look good.
It's not a good look, Larry. It's not a good
Yeah,
look.
well,
And I'm saying to myself, oh man. And so the lady walks out. She walks out of the bathroom, and I stop and I pause and I start thinking. I start thinking about Safe Start, and I think about the state terrorist pattern. Well, I walk out the door, Larry, and the lady is standing right there with that little boy, and she says, "Mister, you went in the wrong restroom." I had went in the wrong restroom, Larry, but the whole state terrorist pattern started when I first pulled into the parking lot. So you being the master of Safe Start, you can answer the question. When I first pulled into the parking lot, what state was I in? What state?
complacency.
Complacency. Why'd you say complacency, Larry?
Well, well, complacent because you're used to the snow and all the rest of it, but I'd also throw in maybe a bit of rushing. Not that you're physically moving faster, but already your brain is starting to think about what have I got to get in Walmart? Where is it? This is a different Walmart. Wonder where the stuff is here. So
Yeah,
you're doing 2 things at once while you're getting out of the car, probably,
good
right?
point.
You're not just
Yeah.
thinking about getting out of the car.
Okay, so that complacency led to what state? I mean, what era?
Well, the eyes and mind not on task, balance, traction, grip.
I didn't look at where I was stepping. I didn't even think about where I was stepping because I was thinking about exactly what you said. I was thinking about what I'm going to do when I get inside of Walmart. Okay, I wasn't thinking, but I have to get in there first. But I wasn't thinking about that. And the point when I tell that story is the fact that if you fail to recognize that you're doing those things, you'll continually do those things. So I get inside the
Well,
store.
actually, Jack, it's when you said it dominoes, it's a great way. I mean, it's obviously the way I portray it visually and the graphics and the videos and all the rest of the stuff. But the thing about it dominoes is that the dominoes tend to get bigger. In other words, one state leads, in other words, you're frustrated because you can't get anywhere in traffic. You try to rush, and then there's a bozo who won't pull over. That makes you more frustrated. Like, in other words, that it dominoes, but it dominoes up usually, not down.
Exactly. And so with me, if you want to look at the whole story, the biggest cost to me was embarrassment. But what's more embarrassing, falling in the parking lot or walking inside a restroom of the opposite sex? So it actually did grow. It actually did grow worse.
Oh, for sure it did. But I mean, as you've said many times when you're telling the story, Another way that all of this wouldn't have happened is if I had just broke my hip when I fell out the first time,
Yeah,
because it
yeah.
was pretty, it was pretty sudden, right? And
I
you know,
could have
you
broke my hip. I could have hit my head on that back, that little knob that sticks out of the door jamb. I could have
yeah,
done any number of things. But I, like I say, amazingly, I didn't get hurt. But really amazingly with me, Larry, when it occurred, and we since we're talking about storytelling, not so much about the safe start process, but as we're talking about storytelling, none of that was funny. But I told it just like it happened. None of it was funny when it happened to me. Not to me, at least. Now, I'm not saying that other people probably wasn't laughing, but it wasn't funny to me. But I, even though it happened many years ago, um, I still laugh when I tell it, when I think about it. Man, how in the world, and I think about it often when I get out of the car, how in the world could I have fallen? And like I said, what I said is exactly what people are thinking. When I hit the ground, the first thing you think about is, I wonder if anybody saw me.
right, exactly,
Yeah.
yeah,
And so everybody can relate to that because probably everybody has fallen at once they reach an adulthood. Well, actually, period. Everybody has fallen before, so they can relate to that. And how does it feel to be embarrassed when you fall in front of someone? So that's when you come to the Walmart story. It's a process story, but it's also a narrative story. But the way it's narrated through, people can now see the process of Safe Start. And like I said, it dominoes. I take it on further, and I ask, "What state was I in?" After the lady tells me my jacket was messed up, and you would say, "What state?"
right. And at the very end, I kind of interrupted you at the flow there. Sorry, Jack, but at the very end of the story, you actually do the equivalent of, and the moral of the story is, and I don't want to steal your line here, although I think I know it word for word, but what at the end of, I'll just ask the question, at the end of the whole thing, Jack, what was it you realized?
I realized I went into the wrong restroom. Is what I
Yeah.
realized.
No,
In
but I
her
mean that you need, I remember you saying all the time, I needed to start using this stuff,
start
right?
using what I'm teaching other people to
Yeah.
use. And I'm like, so, and like I said, this was early on in my career as Safe Start, but I need to start using these tools. And I talk about that when I talk in terms of leadership. We talk about using this process, but when people see you, are you using it? Now, there probably wasn't anybody in there from my Safe Start class, but are you using the techniques that you're trying to teach people to use? So it's more of walking the talk when we talk about leading.
Yeah. And the next, if you will, kind of story that you use really well, and we all can certainly benefit from it, is where I call it, if you will, the values in action story. Like listening, Dr. Stoker, Sarah Stoker in England.
Yeah.
Well, Sarah tells the story about the first time that she self-triggered. And this has got, it's not, it's up there, Jack, in terms of rival in the Walmart story in a way. You know,
Mm-hmm.
she's going to a big meeting, with her previous employer in
Mm-hmm.
a different city. But she could drive there. It's in the UK. And um, when she gets there, she realizes that she doesn't have her shampoo. She doesn't have a brush. She doesn't have cream rinse or conditioner, but she figures she can make do with a comb at the front desk, and they'll give her shampoo, and cream rinse will probably be at the hotel. But then she realizes that she packed her daughter's pantyhose, or tights, as they say in the UK, and her daughter's 12 years old. So now she's stuck. She's got to go down to the supermarket 2 junctions away, and she dashes into the store, gets the brush, gets the shampoo, the conditioner, gets the tights, and as she's going to pay, she can't find her car keys. And so she starts freaking out. Everybody in the store starts freaking out. They're running all over where the brushes are, where the shampoo is, where the tights are. Nobody can find the keys anywhere. Finally, in a panic, she runs out to her car, and it's a convertible. She hadn't even, put the top up. The keys are in the ignition, so somebody could have just driven away with her car.
Wow.
And so she gets in, puts it in drive, and starts diagonal across the parking lot. And then she stops and goes, "What are you doing?" And she said, "I just put the car in park, sat for about no more than a 30, 40 seconds till I calmed down, took about 4 deep breaths, and then I drove to the presentation." And she can say, "I think honestly, that was the first time that I self-triggered,
Hmm.
and I knew that it worked." And
Yeah.
so that, when she, like that sort of, I used to tell this story about running out of my house with all the books under my arm and everything like that. And for the
Hmm.
first time ever, I slowed before I stepped instead of stepping and getting the reflex and hopefully not bailing all over the concrete steps. And I
Yeah.
remember looking back at it going, that would have hurt.
Yep.
I even thought about your line too, Jack. I'm like fine china. I still look good, but I break real easy.
It may look good, but it breaks easy, Larry.
Well, Jack, and then probably just before, because I don't want you to have to be rushed in this. What about the power of a dramatic story, Jack? Could you tell us the dock plate story?
Well, first of all, let me preempt by saying whenever you tell a story that involves emotion, even though this story happened many, many, many years ago, it's coming up on 30 years, Larry,
No,
believe it
I'm
or
I'm
not.
counting on you bringing us back up, Jack, at the end of this story.
I,
So
bring,
I don't,
I
I
bring
got
back.
I got nothing planned here if you don't have an exit for
Well,
sure.
my motto. I don't want to leave you on a downer. No, I don't want anybody. They leave here crying and I'm never going to his session again because he he brought me down. Well, I'm gonna make you feel something in this story, Larry. And the thing about telling it, if you can tell an emotional story like this, by all means, I advise you to do it because it does impact other people. For me, I use it and I tell people it's my motivation for um, for talking to people about safety because never in my life would I have imagined up to that point, that I would have had to deal with anything like this. I've only had to go to one home and tell someone that their loved one wasn't going to make it home again. And by far in my life and in my career, it's probably the most difficult thing I've ever had to do in my life. And I never want to do that again because there's no amount of practice that can prepare you for what you're going to say when you tell them that their loved one is not going to come home because of a workplace accident. But a
Jack,
great,
I
great
was
story.
I was out in Vancouver Island once doing a session. This is years back too, just beginning a Safe Start. And the guy who brought me out brought all these contractors, and they do hand logging out in the island, right? Because it's so steep, 40 degrees, so it's not machine logging, and pretty rough and tumble bunch, Jack. About 200 of them there. And here's how he opened it. He said, "I don't know if any of you ever had to go and knock on somebody's door and tell them that their husband isn't coming home again. But," he said, "what I've found the best way to do it is," and I'm sitting at the back listening to this going, "the best way to do this? You've had to do this so often you could learn from trial and error?"
Hmm.
And then he goes through you knock on the door, you tell them what happened. They hug you and they cry you, and then they start trying to punch you and they're mad and then they hug you again. And he goes through this whole sequence. He says it happens every time. And I'm just like, oh my God, I thought my job sucked sometimes, planes being canceled, things like that. Goodness gracious. Imagine, the best way I learned how to do this is, oh my goodness. So, anyhow, Jack, back to you.
All right. So, like I said, the year was 1993. It was August the 13th. It happened to be a Friday the 13th. And I remember it like it happened yesterday. 1993. Wow, Larry, this is almost 30 years ago, but I can remember it like it happened yesterday. We had 22 dock plates that had to be serviced, and they were serviced from Sunday night to Friday morning. And just so I don't take too much time here, Larry, I'll tell you.
Don't worry
Uh,
about it, Jack. We got lots. We got lots.
okay, so I walked up. I hadn't checked on the guy all week long, but I walked up to him I was on the outside of the building, and for those that don't know what a dock plate is, it's designed to drive a forklift into a tractor trailer. And I walked up on this guy, and as I walked up on him, I noticed that he's not using the safety armor as a part of the lockout tagout procedure for this piece of equipment. Now, keep in mind, I've already told you up to this point that I was a little bit of a terrible Terry Tate type of guy, and I felt like intimidation was the best way to get people to do what they needed to do. The company that I was working for at the time felt like my career wouldn't be long if I kept that as part of my tool belt. So they were sending me to classes, and I remember asking this guy, "Shouldn't you be using the safety arm as a part of the lockout tagout for this piece of equipment?" And he looked me dead in the eye and he said, "I've been doing it this way for years." Now, I'm saying to myself, this is not an acceptable answer. I want to give him some of this terrible Terry Tate now. But he told me he had been doing it this way for years. Now, like I said, they had been sending me to these seminars on how to deal with difficult people. And they say you should try to get the employee to agree to do the right thing. So I said to myself, okay, I'm going to try some of this. I said, well, excuse me, can I get you to use the safety arm as a part of the lockout tagout for this piece of equipment? And he turns around this time with a little bit more vigor in his voice and he says, "Didn't I tell you I've been doing it this way for years?" Now I'm wanting to give him some of this terrible Terry Tate because this classroom stuff doesn't seem to be working, Larry. And so, but I remember vividly that it's now 5:25. And the reason why I know it's 5:25 because the alarm for the last break happens at 5:25 every day. And in automotive back then, we were not relieving the system. We had a process that everybody goes to break at the exact same time. Everybody goes to break together. That was one of our company policies. So the alarm sounds. 5 minutes later, everybody's going to break. That's giving the assembly line time to come around and start the emptying out of the process. So I go into the break room and I'm thinking all the way to the break room, how am I going to get this guy to do what I need him to do? And I get in the break room, and one of my buddies asked me about trout lining, going fishing with him when we get off work. Because this is Friday morning. This starts our weekend. So now I'm thinking about fishing, okay? I go back to my office after break is over with because now I'm thinking about what, Larry?
Fishing.
Fishing, okay? I'm not thinking about this guy. I'm going to get all the paperwork done I can get done prior to the end of the shift. So once the end of the shift comes, I can run my machine efficiency numbers, all my numbers, and I can get out as quickly as possible, head to the river. I can start my fishing. Well, about 6:15 a.m., somebody comes into my office and they say, "Hey, Jack, can you tell that guy to move his truck out of door number 14?" Now, I wasn't aware of what door he was at the time, but when I went out there, I see that he was at the same door that he was in when I approached him earlier. But now I notice that the dock plate is down. And without even thinking about it, Larry, I walked on top of the dock plate and I looked in the back of his pickup truck. And when I looked in the back of his pickup truck, I noticed that his tools are laid out in the back of his pickup truck. So it's telling me that this guy has been working out of his pickup truck rather than taking the tools underneath the dock plate with him. Now, I didn't bother to notice any of that when I was there the first time. And then I see Jimmy, the guy who moves our tractor trailers for us. And I say, "Hey, Jimmy, have you seen this guy?" He said, "No, Jack, I hadn't seen him." I said, "Do me a favor, go look in the smoker's hut. I'm going to go over here to the trucker's lounge." Well, I go over to the trucker's lounge. And remember, this is Friday morning, so it is full of people. Okay. And I look around and I don't see this guy anywhere in there. And then I come back to the dock plate and I walk right on top of the dock plate again. And then I wait to see Jimmy come back around. I say, "Hey, Jimmy, did you see him?" And he said, "No, Jack, I didn't see him." I said, "Do me a favor, look inside of that cab and see if he's in there sleeping. Because anybody that's worked midnight shift, you know you'll take a nap on that last break." Jimmy looks inside the cab. He says, "He's not in here, Jack." Now I'm standing up inside. Jimmy's down on the parking lot below, and Jimmy starts to walk toward the back of the pickup truck. And as he starts to walk back to the back of the pickup truck, I see his eyes get big and I see his mouth go open. It's at that moment I realize I'm standing on top of this guy underneath this dock plate. Felt like I was standing there for 10 minutes, but it's probably only 10 seconds. But when something like this happens, Larry, time literally stands still. I yelled inside, told him to call 911 and get me a forklift out here immediately. I jumped off the dock plate down to the parking lot. Jimmy and I pushed his truck out of the way. And I remember his truck was a standard. We pushed it out of the way. And I can remember every detail about this night, except for I don't remember stopping that truck. I just remember pushing it out of the way. And I told him to get me a forklift out here. And we're starting to lift it. They get the forklift in place and we start to lift the dock plate up off this guy. And they're yelling at me from the inside, "No, Jack, no," because the paramedics are telling us not to try to rescue him. Now, at this time, I was a first responder, so I knew that my responsibility was to make sure that the scene was safe so the paramedics could get in there. But for me, it didn't feel like it was happening fast enough. From the time we called 911 to the time the paramedics, the fire department, fire truck, first fire truck arrived was 3 minutes and 57 seconds. But if you'd asked me how long it took, I would have told you it was 30 minutes because that's what it felt like to me. It wasn't happening fast enough. So we went ahead and lifted the dock plate up. And when we lifted it up, the sight I saw is something I never want to see again. And even though it was almost 30 years ago, I can remember it like it happened last night. When this dock plate came down on top of this guy, it smashed him in that position. I can still see the copper rivets on the back of this guy's Levi's jeans. That's how descriptive I remember. And as I looked at him laying there, I can recall what he said to me. "I've been doing it this way for years." And I thought to myself right then and there, and you may remember this, Larry. I thought to myself that right then and there, how can somebody who has been doing it this way for years still get hurt like this? And I remember thinking, when you asked us in 2005 when we were in Cincinnati, Ohio, about a story where the states didn't take place, I remember crying. And I fight tears now. But I remember crying because I realized then something I didn't realize all those years ago. This guy had some states going on. And
Mhm.
I would ask you, Larry, what state would you call it?
Oh, complacency stage two, right? Where,
Big time. Big
you
time.
know, it starts it starts with air, the complacency, but then when the airs don't amount to much, it
Mm-hmm.
eventually starts to affect your decision making. It's I remember, I don't know if you saw the show with Anthony Panapinto. He took the complacency continuum that I put together, whatever that was,
Mm-hmm.
2010 or something, and he put it right over the graph for COVID in South Africa, and he said it's just totally it's almost a perfect fit. He said, the first part's the air, the second part's the decisions.
Yeah, yeah. But like I said, man, it was for me, that was,
Like the
and I
first
tell
time ever, Jack. I'm glad to have reading glasses. It kind of covers up the tear
you,
bit a bit. God, I've heard that story so many. Still, though, one of the things that I hopefully y'all got everybody listening to this is that there is I don't know, Jack and I call it salt and pepper, Tabasco. You pick what you want, but there's there's enough like the copper rivets, right? The little
mm-hmm.
details. I remember Gary and the Kenny story talking
Mm-hmm.
about how some of the eggs were brown and white when Phyllis was coming out of the hen house, right? Those sorts of things. And so the emotion, I think, obviously burns the memory, a little bit deeper. And
Mm-hmm.
you go back to some of that sort of stuff. Um, but
Yeah.
yeah, it definitely does make you, think a bit here and there too about just,
Well,
I
Larry,
think
one thing, if
how
I can,
how
if I
emo-
may
how
say,
how motivating a story can also be as well too, Jack. Like quite often things like you and the dock plate story, Kenny, Gary and the Kenny story,
mhm.
sometimes those events become pivotal in your life, and you start going in a different direction, right?
Well, you look at, and when oftentimes I tell that story outside of a speech, if I tell it to someone, I'll tell it as a means of letting them know that, hey, when you get hurt, there's consequences. Number one, there's physical. Number two, there's organizational because somebody has to replace you. Number three, sometimes there's social ramifications, those consequences. But almost every time somebody gets hurt, there's an emotional consequence. There's somebody at home that has to deal with that. And when I conclude that story, I tell people that this wasn't the home that I had to go to and tell them that their loved one died. Because about 2009, I went back to Missouri and I saw my buddy. And he said, I told him what I was doing. I told him about Safe Start, and this was the first story that came up in his mind as well. And so we went to go talk to his wife, and this is the emotional side of it for me, Larry, is because as I talked to that lady, she told me everything that this man had been through since 1993, and I didn't feel sorry for him. Not that I'm a callous guy or anything like that. I felt sorry for her because you
Right.
think of all the things that lady had desires of doing that she never got a chance to do because of one moment of complacency with her husband. And because she said, for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, and sickness or health, to death do us part. She had to pay for her husband's complacency. And I use that story, I've used it in the past for the rougher guys, the roughnecks, the guys that don't think it applies to them. And they all can relate to things that they have done, and they've done it that way for years.
Well, I would try to, I would actually with because at the beginning, right, it was a lot of oil rigs, hand loggers,
Mhm.
railroaders, and a lot of rough and tumble industries in northwestern Canada and stuff. And I remembered asking the guys, I said, so how many of you guys secretly worry that your kids will turn out to be like you?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
it was funny, but you could kind of come in the back door with those tough guys that way. And they go, oh my God, my boy turns out to be like me. There's no guarantee he'll be as lucky as I was, right? So, trying to get them to look at it that way as well. But certainly I think the stories have an effect on everybody, whether they cry or whether they don't, Jack. They feel them for
Mhm.
sure.
Yeah, yeah,
Now,
they definitely.
let's just, I mean, I don't want to be too instructional here, but let's just come back, Jack, just to the sequencing, how you sequence stories. Like obviously, um, I've got my whatever you'd call it formula where I like to, open up with a funny story
Hmm.
just to
Hmm.
kind of get everybody, disarmed, right? And certainly so they don't, worry about, oh, he's trying to sell me something kind of thing. So you start off with it. Well, there's it's a realistic expectation for some of these folks, right? They've been to lots of things that were nothing more than a glorified sales pitch before, right? So,
Hmm.
I think they've got a right to be skeptical, but nevertheless, open up with a funny story and then a close call that happened to me
Well,
where,
see, we call that sandwiching, Larry. We call that
yeah,
sandwiching.
and then then you've got the guy who wasn't so lucky. And then you've got to have, if you will, another kind of funny story to sort of bring the mood right back up. Or you could
Hmm.
do just the three-layer sandwich if you weren't such a fraidy cat like me and you wanted to have the one warm-up kind of story, if you will, as well, right? But
Well,
so
I like to flow with three stories. I want to start off. It doesn't necessarily have to be humorous, but it's not a downer.
right,
Okay.
right.
Now, now, now that story, the Doc Play story, is definitely a downer. I've never saw anybody look at that story and laugh and think it was funny.
No,
But then I always close out with some type of humor. And it doesn't have to be a grand thing of humor, but I'll talk about, oftentimes when I tell that story, I'll talk about my grandson and teaching him how to use Safe Start and how he watched the video and he enjoyed the video. And after the video was over with, I wanted to talk to him about watching the Boo Boo Bandits. And you may remember this story, Larry. And I said, come on over here, AJ. Let's talk about Safe Start. What you learned. He said, okay. I said, come on over here and wash your hands. Now he walks past the stove. Now the stove isn't on, Larry, but he looks up at me and he says, Dada, that's hot. Now, you know where he got that from, right? He learned that from watching the video. I don't know about you, but I didn't learn it like that. My daddy said, "Go ahead and touch it." I bet you won't do that anymore.
I know. I had an aunt who was like that. He said, let them touch it, they'll never do it again. And I
Yeah,
said, well, if that's the case, why don't we delay it till they're dead?
yeah, yeah. And so I
I
start
mean,
off with that, and
obviously,
then
if one's enough, why don't we just never have it? That'll be good. Oh, I don't know. Hurt the
mhm,
children, that'll learn them.
yeah,
But anyhow, Jack, that's a great example of building the humor back up. There's another one
mhm,
though that I kind of wanted you to tell. It's piggybacking on the rules again, and the rules not being enough. But it's about the farmhand and the bullseyes.
oh yeah, okay. So really, that is when I explain what traditional safety is. To me, that's what it looks like. And like I intro this, and I say, I like to start off by telling stories because stories help you remember and recall what you're trying to teach them. But if somebody was to ask me, what do I think about traditional safety? This is how I'd explain it to them. I say, there's this businessman and he's going along this country road. And as he's driving along this country road, he sees these signs on the fence post. Now, every one of these signs that he sees has a target on them, and every one of the targets has the bullseye shot dead center. Now, this guy, he's a bit of a marksman, so he's impressed by this. Continually driving down the road. Every sign that he sees has a target on him. Every one of the targets has the bullseye shot dead center. So he drives a little bit further, and he sees his farmhand. And he asked the farmhand, he said, "Can you tell me who did that shooting on those signs out there?" Well, that farmhand said, "I did that shooting." He said, "Well, how did you manage to hit the bullseye dead center like that every single time?" He said, "Oh, man, it's nothing to it." He said, "What do you mean it's nothing to it?" He said, "Oh, it's easy." He said, "Well, come on, share your secret with me. Tell me how you did that." He said, "You really want to know how I did that?" He said, "Yeah, man, I got to know. How did you do that?" He said, "Well, the first thing I did was I took the shot and then I drew the target around it." And for people that can't get it, I tell them you'll get that one on the way home. But
No, no, but
but
you
that's
said
the
it.
way
You said it
traditional
before,
safety is.
Jack. So every time somebody get hurt, we make a new rule, we make a new
Yeah,
procedure, we put a
yeah,
new guard, we do this, we do a new that.
yeah. And so that's the analogy of it. So when somebody gets hurt, that's us taking a shot. Then what do? We sit in a room, we do an accident investigation, and if we already have a safety rule, we'll either modify that rule or we'll create a brand new rule around that one incident. And then you have to stop and ask yourself, look at how many rules these people have to try to remember and decipher through. And most of the time, people don't get hurt because they don't know the rule. Okay. And I
Yeah.
bring up the point, this running of the stop signs. People don't run stop signs. The majority of us don't run them intentionally. We run them because we don't see them. Okay. Because our minds are somewhere else. And what I try to do is display. And people, I mean, they grab that target story and they run with it. I can't tell you
Well,
how many
Jack, I
people.
used to say to people, look, I mean, I'm not talking about going through a very yellow light or a pink light. I'm talking about where you went right through a red light blind or the
Mm-hmm.
stop sign blind. But if it's just the proverbial California stop, like slow
Yeah.
down, or you are running the yellow light, you're actually looking for line of fire and you're not going to go if there's a truck coming.
Yeah.
But when
Exactly.
you're not even looking at the truck and you don't see the red light, and then you look at the statistics, it's 25% of the serious vehicle collisions are at intersections, right? So,
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
then back to your point, do you think any of these people wanted to hit the truck? Of course not. Just like they didn't want to cut their fingers off, right? So,
Mhm.
anyhow, we'll end up talking about states and errors without meaning to, Jack. So I'll
Yeah.
I'll I'll bring you back on to um. Well, look, I think we should probably ask for some questions from the audience. I should sum it up a bit though. One of the things, well, you've heard me say this many times to people, is that whenever we hear a story that starts with a date,
Yeah.
this is likely not going to be a
Good.
funny story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and there's a reason that people remember the date, obviously, because of the significance of the event. Um, So use the date in the story if it's a significant story. Don't do it any other time. I mean, it's if you will, it's reserved for special occasions, I would suggest. But the details in the stories, even some of the more insignificant details that don't necessarily think are all that important, a few
Mhm.
of those things here and there help other people. Like they're imagining what's going on. So a few details really helps them sort of, get the gist of it. A little visual, if you're using a flip chart, is great to show movement. If you're
Mhm.
handy with PowerPoint, you can kind of do it with arrows and stuff. But if you think about this story, though, you don't want the screen to be overpowering. You're the storyteller.
Exactly.
So, like, when Jack's telling a story, quite often the screen's blank. He'll
Mhm.
show the odd picture here and there or something like that, but quite often it's just you. So if you're going to show movement, though, you and the flip chart are both in frame, and
Yes.
that's a really good one too. Any other sort of tips in terms of using visual
Well,
aids
that's
to
one. That's
storytelling?
one of the tips I often tell people is never write your story out on the screen, because people will have a tendency to read the story and not listen to you. If it's your story, you shouldn't have to write it out on the screen because you should remember it all. If it's your story, so don't write the story out on the screen. Is one thing that I tell people. But another thing that you hit on that I often share with people is that when you're telling a story, if you're using graphics, when you use the graphics, a couple of rules of thumbs that I tell all of our consultants. Anytime you're talking about direction of travel on a road, always draw direction of travel on your flip chart. If you good enough with PowerPoint, put direction of travel. Show what direction you were moving in. And anytime you're working at heights, show elevation height. That gives people a better simulation of what's going on. I know I talk about being jumping from brownstone to brownstone, the big tall apartment buildings. You got a 6 to 8 foot gap, but you're anywhere from 20 to 30 feet off the ground. Okay. And that right there is letting people realize the severity if something did go wrong. So if you say, hey, I was working at 12 feet, hanging off a ladder, like Gary's story, and he's hanging there, stuck up on the roof, that story right there. You think about what distance that was for him to try to get down.
Well,
Okay.
I still picture him saying, I'll just pull myself back up. And he goes,
Yeah.
well, maybe not. So
Yeah.
now I'm just how long will I hang here till I fall? Oh gosh, yeah.
Yeah. So those
And
important
certainly
important points.
obviously the entertainment component. I remember Kevin Cobb saying things at the beginning of the career once, when he said, I want some value for the time my butt is in this seat here,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
want to lecture. I don't want, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that. I heard it from my mother and my grandmother and my school teachers and everybody else. I don't want to hear it from you. I want some
Mhm.
value. Provide me with some value. And the entertainment that the stories bring, as well as the credibility and, if you will, the motivation and the power, some of that stuff, just to try to tie it into the title, is obviously going to get you a lot further in terms of influence. And I think you also did a pretty good job, Jack, of sort of outlining the limitations of control as well. Not
Yeah.
to say we don't need controls, and neither
Mhm.
Jack nor I are saying get rid of the rules or the speed limits and don't worry about people ever having to get their brakes checked or things like that. No, no, no. We're
Mhm.
just saying that 7 years, 7 fingers. It's not enough, right?
None
Um,
of them got hurt because they didn't know the rule.
yeah, well, and the red light and the rule doesn't save you, only seeing the red light does, right?
Hmm.
Um, hey, this is Mike. Any questions from anybody? I've been trying to scan the chat here and there, but it even though I've heard Jack tell these stories a million times, it seems like I didn't do I didn't do a great job of it. Um, is this for construction? Well, I don't know, Pete. I mean, I guess it would be for any industry.
Well, I guess I can answer that because I actually did this topic yesterday here in Chicago for the construction safety conference. So I would say that's a yes. So it took got high ratings and they enjoyed it. We talked about how telling story liberates other people to share their stories, and then you're more apt to even the learning becomes shared when you share stories.
Well, and it's, I mean, I think being a, like I've said this to you before, Jack. I mean, I don't think I'm the most stubborn person in the world at all. I think, like a lot of people, I think I'm reasonable and flexible. And then
Hmm.
when I add up how many people have actually really influenced me to change in my life, it's not very many. You've been one of them for sure. So thanks very much for that. I mean, a positive influence to everybody. It's like, I'm not saying Jack hasn't ever led me astray on any of these trips, but we've never got into any trouble. So there you go. Even in Vegas. So there. Um, but Jack, thanks so much for. I know you're in between jobs there in Chicago, and you're off to speak in another conference tomorrow. So
Hmm.
thank you very very much for taking the time to talk with us, to share the stories, and also the insights, if you will. Any last words for everybody, Jack, or should we just sign off and say goodbye?
Well, the last word I have for everybody is that everybody has a story. Don't be afraid to tell it. You never know who it may impact or
Yeah, that's
influence.
excellent. Okay. Now, April 14th, I believe it is a Thursday. We're going to be back with Chris Ross, and we're going to talk about positive messaging. And it's going to be a really, really, I don't want to give too much of Chris's thunder away. It's sort of like, I didn't want to tell anybody the Walmart story in terms of preempting Jack being on the show. But I think it was he opened up his talk at the American Society for Safety Professionals. It was simple as this. He said, um, went into the store, the local gas station, convenience store, but they also sell fishing tackle, fishing bait. He lives in Alaska, in Anchorage. And he just looked at the owner and he said, have you ever thought of changing the sign? The sign says, don't forget the ice. The owner looks at him and he says, to what? He says, just change it to remember the ice. And I think sales went up 400% or something like that. So I'm not sure if I've got all the detail there, but again, it was like one of those stories, Jack. Even though I don't have all the detail, I never forgot the whole thing right there when he opened up with that story. But there's going to be even more of that. And this to me is really like picking the low hanging fruit, everybody. I mean, it doesn't, how much easier does it get than just, a little bit of positive messaging to get that kind of a return? So that's April 14th, I believe. Let me just double check this since I'm in the air business a bit. Yes, and that'd be the day before Good Friday at 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock Pacific, 1 o'clock Eastern. And I think that I'm not sure between daylight savings time, what time that'll be in England and the UK and Europe. But thanks again, everybody. And Jack, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us. All right.
Thank you, Larry.
Bye, everybody. Bye, Jack.
Bye bye.